Tale of Three Dictators, in a lot of ways, it's a cautionary tale. It's a cautionary tale. One of the things when we talked about Marx, we identified, remember we went through the worldview of Marx's Communist Manifesto and realized his ideas are rooted in false assumptions. Most prominently that there is no God, but secondly, flowing from that, really a false understanding of human nature. And if anybody tells you that human beings are basically good, or basically good and getting better, this should be a cautionary tale that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's a saying by Lord Acton, a British philosopher, basically says human beings, when you consolidate power, are prone to corruption, and if they have absolute power, absolute corruption. Sometimes we look at the course of human history and we forget that. We take for granted that the American founders knew really well this premise. They understood the fallen nature of man, and we have three branches of government and dispersal of power. From we the people all the way up to the presidency, and all kinds of layers of dispersion of power because of that. Okay? But if we look at these three dictators, these political leaders, and I use leaders very loosely, we'll see that it's a consolidation of power, no checks and balances, no rule of law, absolute power corrupting absolutely. So in that way, it's a cautionary tale. All right, objectives for today. Over the course of today and Thursday, we're going to look at Stalin, Mao, and Hitler. We're going to identify their main ideas. We're going to explore the consequences of those ideas. And then in discussion group, we're going to talk about, are there any lessons for today? Are there any lessons for today? What do we take away from this? Or is this just an anomaly of the 20th century? Is this only possible in the context of the 20th century? Okay. All right. A couple of questions to ponder. My discussion group has already pondered one of these. Why was a socialist candidate for president, or currently a member of Congress, so popular? And why are Marxist ideas back in vogue? I've showed you the poll of your generation. But yet, a Nazi candidate would never be tolerated. What's the difference between these, or the perception of these two ideologies, these sets of ideas? Another way to ask it is, why is there a favorable view of socialism? Okay? And Marx's ideas, even though it's never worked anywhere, and the consequences that we'll see today and on Thursday are dire, are deadly, are destructive. Okay? And yet, those ideas are still in vogue. And Nazism we dismiss out of hand, but socialism not so much. Why is that? Okay? And we'll talk about that. If you go back to those first two questions I asked, why is socialism, why don't we know the history of socialism? Well, frankly, it's not taught. The history of Hitler is taught. Okay? All right. So let me give you a couple of reminders just to kind of circle back around to the Communist Manifesto. Then I'll tell you some things about Joseph Stalin. Okay? He's actually a pretty interesting character of history. But a couple of things about Marx. Marx envisioned the communist revolution, the revolution of the workers, would happen in industrial nations. They envisioned that it would happen in Great Britain or France or one of those heavily industrialized nations. He never conceived that it would happen in an agrarian, rural, non-industrial context. So that's a revision. When you look at Lenin, Stalin, Mao, they're revising Marx's ideas and applying them to a new context. Okay? Some people say that's why their application of Marx doesn't count against Marx. Okay? It's still Marx's ideas. But when we look at Stalin and Mao, there's a specific problem that both of them face that's included in your readings in terms of how they fully implement a communist revolution in a non-industrialized state, in an agrarian state. What are the unique problems that they have to overcome, and how do they do that? Okay? First of all. Second of all, remember the major problem with Marx's revolutionary sequence is how do you get from the dictatorship of the proletariat to the withering away of the state to the final stage of the workers' paradise? How do you do that? It's one of the main scholarly criticisms of Marx's revolutionary sequence. How does that happen? If you come from a biblical worldview perspective, you know that once the dictatorship of the proletariat is put into place, the proletariat is not likely to give up power. Back to Acton, the idea that absolute power corrupts absolutely. What's the end game? What's the goal? What's the impetus to give up that power? And so if you look at Marx's revolutionary sequence, it's even harder in a totalitarian regime established by Stalin and Mao, because how do you get there? How do you eliminate the dictatorship of the proletariat? So if you walk in and look at Stalin or Mao, the stage of the revolutionary sequence that they're in is the dictatorship of the proletariat. Okay? That's where they are. That's where they get stuck. And if you read Mao, if you read Stalin, it's all about how does the proletariat establish power. Very little talk about ushering in that workers' paradise. It's all about that dictatorship. And again, how do you wrest power away from those who have it? Okay.